Thank you sincerely, Liam, for giving us all those facts and figures in such a visual way. And I'm feeling quite despondent, but I think we kind of need to go to that low place before we can consider the things that might need to be done to protect that. So thank you very much. The final talk in this session is how can the Assembly approach this large and complex topic of biodiversity loss. This is a problem that has engaged the EAG, myself and the Secretariat for the summer, as I said previously. And I'm delighted that a member of our expert advisory group, Dr. Micheál Ó Cinnéide, who is a former diplomat, former director of the EPA, former director of the Marine Institute, will outline the various approaches that could be taken to addressing biodiversity decline and the sectoral approach that we will hopefully take. So this is a fundamental part of the Assembly, and we very much need your feedback generated from the discussions that we'll have on this approach as well. So, Gurmagat Micheál.
Gurmagat Evian, and good afternoon, folks. So this is a nice, simple talk compared to some of the other talks, I hope. It's about a signpost or a mapping for the way we're going to do our work for the rest of the Assembly into the next coming weekends. So we're proposing a particular way of going about our work. So just to say, there are differing approaches to biodiversity, and you're hearing all of them, and you'll continue to hear all the different ones. But to put it in a very simple way, you could say there's three main approaches. One of them is a scientific approach. You could call it taxonomy or the family tree. And that approach is very well embedded in science. Carl Linnaeus was a doctor who was a professor in Uppsala University. And about 250 years ago, he came up with this system, which has become, I suppose, the foundation of a lot of the disciplines. And you can still visit his house and his garden. It's a fantastic place to go and visit. So all of the work that's been done in the last 250 years builds on this idea of taxonomy. And we heard a few minutes ago from Liam that we have 32,000 species in Ireland. And if you look it up, you'll see there's about 8 million species in the world, 5 million species of insects alone, and 2.5 million species of plants and animals. So as Evin said this morning, that's a bit complicated. And how do we eat this elephant? So there are other ways of thinking about biodiversity and biodiversity loss, but we're going to use each of these three different frameworks. The second framework, going back to the first session we had on the 14th of May, you'll remember Robert Watson gave a talk on video, and some of it was raised again today, which is the causes of biodiversity loss. And again, Taz Crowe talked about that earlier today, and one of the causes was climate change. And Laura talked about the links between climate change and biodiversity. So we're using that approach as well. So this idea of using the drivers of climate change or drivers of biodiversity loss. But the third approach, which in a way follows on from those, it's like building a house. So the foundation is the science in terms of taxonomy and species, and then the next layer then on top of that, looking at causes and so on, drivers. But we're now going to go on and we're proposing an approach just to organize our work, which is around what we call a sectoral approach or a landscape approach. And again, that's something that I think that once we explain it, hopefully you'll all find it reasonably clear. So a sectoral approach, you would have heard a little bit of this from various other speakers already, includes the main sectors of land use in Ireland, how this country of ours is organised in terms of land. So agriculture and forestry is about more than 70% of all our land area. And obviously, it's a major focus for both good practice in biodiversity and also biodiversity loss. It's not one or the other. Both are happening in all of these sectors. Similarly, we will be looking at freshwater and at peatlands on another day. And both of those are scheduled to happen in the next weekend that we will have in early October. We go on then to the marine environment, which is 9 times larger than our land area. We have an enormous marine resource. You've seen some slides on that, and coastlands. And also, we had questions today from people, what about the urban landscape? We will be looking at that, urban and man-made landscapes together, and both of those will be in the weekend in early November. And then the fifth category, if you want to call it that, or sector, which is not completely separate from the others because it overlaps with them, is protected sites or the Natura 2000 network. Tomorrow morning, in a way, we're going to shift gear already. We're moving in to this more sectoral approach to some extent because Andy Bleasdale from the National Parks and Wildlife will be talking about protected sites, which is about 13% of the country. But actually, quite a lot of those are also agricultural land, so it's not one or the other. So what I'm saying, just to make it as simple as possible, is we're proposing to shift gear and now spend from tomorrow the rest of our time in the next couple of sessions looking at biodiversity through the lens of these different sectors. And how does that link with our terms of reference? It's not specifically spelt out in the terms of reference, but I would say it follows fairly closely from the terms of reference because we're asked to look at various different sectors. And it helps, I think, to put the work that you're doing, I suppose, into practical chunks of conversation. We will have advocates from each of those different sectors, from the farming sector, from forestry, people that are involved in the water sector, NGOs from each of these sectors, giving us an update what's happening in those sectors from a biodiversity point of view, the good news and the bad news, and what are the alternatives, how might we go about it. And the idea then out of that is that we and you together would be able to identify policy options. So again, as I said, it's not exclusive from the others. There will be other kinds of recommendations coming out for sure, but sectoral approach, we think, is a logical way to proceed. And finally, just in terms of recommendations, looking ahead a little bit, that will be towards the end of the work of the Citizens' Assembly. But if you start thinking about it, there's terms of reference included in the pack today. And the first thing it says is opportunities to reverse biodiversity loss. So we're looking for opportunities to reverse biodiversity loss. And I think that when you think about that, one of the main kinds of recommendations we will have is practical, physical, tangible things that can be done on the ground, in local areas, in farms, in schools, around the country, in the cities. So this idea of taking a sectoral approach to recommendations makes sense in terms of thinking about it, but also helps to guide some of the recommendations. Not all the recommendations, because there's also another category of recommendations. Again, if you look at the terms of reference, it says policy coherence and synergies and greater public understanding. So we will be talking about governance. Mary Dobbs and Micheál O'Brien will be talking about that. There was a lot of talk, which was really helpful today, about the governance of climate change. And Laura, I think, did a great job explaining, what's going on in terms of policies there. So we will be discussing as well and making recommendations on how we might improve the governance, or we'll call it the policies on biodiversity. That's one kind of recommendation. But in addition to that, we would say that it makes sense to think about it in terms of recommendations on a sectoral basis. And already this morning, like we had Nicola from Galway from Table 14 saying, what about forestry? That's a sectoral question. And somebody else was asking about farming and so on. So we think like that naturally. A lot of the submissions that are coming in to us, they span multiple sectors in some cases, but there is a fair amount of them that are taking a sectoral approach. So what I'm saying is, if you're okay with this, and we'll have a conversation about it now, we'd like that a good bit of our time would be spent and would be organised in that way between now and the end of the Assembly. So we look forward to working with you. Thank you.